So let's talk about the difference between oils and acrylics. I've been painting seriously for about 20 years. For approximately the first 10 years, I mostly used acrylics. Then for the second 10 years, I mostly used oils. So I'm obviously perpetually learning like we all are, but it's safe to say that I have mastered both to the point of being able to talk about the differences. So as of right now, this is the year 2020, I switch it up with both, but I'm gradually moving back towards acrylics. I absolutely love both of these mediums, but they are very, very different and each come with their own learning curve. I highly recommend becoming proficient in both. It'll make you a better painter with a deeper understanding of how to achieve what you want with your materials, regardless of what ends up being your preference. So here are the main differences between oils and acrylics. Number one is, and the most obvious difference, is the drying speed. Oils dry very slowly. It takes days or weeks. The exception would be quick drying oils called alkyds, but even those dry much slower than acrylics. This is a nice thing because there's no rush to anything. You can start a painting and come back the next day and pick up where you left off, with the paint on your palette still wet, the colors on your canvas still wet enough to mix and blend on the canvas. You can achieve beautiful soft effects with oils by using a large soft blending brush to blend colors together on your canvas. And you can take as much time as you need. If you're a slow painter or you like more time to deliberate over decisions, you'll probably like oils more because you have more time to mix your colors. Because you have more time to play with mixing your colors, it's much easier to create more subtle variations in your paintings with oils. This is a huge pro. However, it also means it's more difficult to not blend colors when you don't want to. You always have to consider the risk of making things muddy or blurry when you want them to be clean and sharp. You might have to think more strategically because you have to let one layer dry completely before the next if you don't want things blended together. Acrylics, meanwhile, dry in about 10 minutes to an hour at most. The exception to this would be if you're adding a retarder to your paints to slow the drying time, but oils will generally take longer to dry regardless. Acrylics are good for you if you're bold and decisive, a quick painter. The paints dry as you are mixing and applying them. This is a great thing if it's what you want. So there are some factors to consider. The richness of your color, luminosity, variety of textures, ability to experiment, and your painting process. Acrylic colors darken slightly as they dry, while oils don't. The binder used in acrylics is white, but it dries clear. This makes the color look lighter to your eyes while you're painting, but then darker as the painting dries and the binder turns clear. This can make it tricky to get a painting that glows with the same light that you can get with oils. This problem is even more pronounced the more acrylic polymer mediums you're mixing into your paint. Oils are consistent from wet to dry. What you see is what you get. This is a plus because it's easier to get the colors you want while you're mixing them. With oils, transparent colors are more transparent. Opaque colors are more opaque. Acrylics have more consistent properties across all the different colors. When working with oils, you'll probably find yourself using layering and glazing to achieve the effects that you want. There's something about the way light shines through thin glazes of oil color that's sensuous and beautiful. The luminosity you can achieve with oil glazes might be a subtle distinction from acrylics, but depending on your artwork, it might be important to you. One of the effects that's easy to achieve with acrylics is hard lines and crisp edges. You can use tape to mask out areas. You can paint sharp detail lines more quickly. This gives you a lot to work with in a shorter time. Acrylics also make it easier to achieve a variety of interesting textures. If you take advantage of the variety of mediums available, from impasto effects, which is very thick texture, to paint pouring, which is liquid paint, all of which dry quickly. You can play more with sculptural effects, and acrylics just give you a more versatile toolbox when it comes to texture. And with acrylics, your surface won't crack over time, no matter what reckless thing you decide to try, and you have to be much more careful with oils. If you want to experiment with the viscosity of your paint or incorporate mixed media into your paintings, acrylics might be the better choice for you. You can achieve similar interesting textures with oils, but it'll take you days or weeks of waiting in between layers, and you have to be careful of the order you do things, or you risk having cracks develop in your painting later. To achieve an impasto effect with oils, I really love using cold wax medium as your base layer, and then you can layer over that with thin layers of oil glazes if you want. Oil paints dry through a chemical reaction involving oxidation. The paint absorbs oxygen and it expands as it dries. So if you apply a fast drying color over a slow drying color, you can end up with the surface of your painting developing cracks. Acrylics don't have this problem because as acrylics dry, the water evaporates out of the paint and the paint shrinks rather than expanding. So acrylics are more versatile, but subtle blending is much more difficult with acrylics. You either have to work very quickly or add a retarder or a slow drying gloss medium to give you a little more time to work with the paint before it dries. You can also achieve a more blended look by working in multiple layers of very thin glazes. This is a great technique, but it takes a lot of practice to do it skillfully. If you want to use glazing techniques with acrylics, they make acrylic glazing mediums now that can help you get a similar effect to oils. Now, while the result will look very similar, while you're working, it doesn't feel quite the same as with oil glazes. Some people might prefer working with oils just because they feel different. Acrylics are more flat and oils are more luminous. This is not a bad thing, it's just different. With acrylics, you end up thinking about layering in a different way. You can achieve similar effects, but the feeling of the medium and the process will be different. With oils, you need to have a deeper understanding of your materials and follow some important rules. Thick over thin and fat over lean. Fat here means more oil and lean means less oil. So as I mentioned, if the top layers of your painting dry before the bottom layers, then the top layers will crack. The thicker your application of paint, the fatter or oilier your paint, the slower it dries. So your bottom layers should be thinner and have less oil in them, and your top layers should be thicker and have more oil. You can break this rule, but if you do, you have to be extra careful that your painting is absolutely completely dry between layers. After your oil painting dries, it's common to see some patches that are dull and matte compared to other parts that are shiny, because depending on your ground and your colors, some of the pigments absorb more oil than others. To fix this problem, it's good to practice what I call oiling out, or finishing your paintings with a diluted coat of oil after they're dry. I have another video that gives more info about what is oiling out and how to do it. With acrylics, you don't have to think about any of that. All the acrylic colors and mediums dry at the same rate and are intermixable with each other. Despite the benefits of the luminosity and easier blending, oils are definitely the more complicated medium to master. Another thing to consider is how will your paintings stand the test of time? We know that oils last for hundreds of years. We also know they become discolored over time because the binder in oil paint, linseed oil, goes yellow over time. This is why old master paintings have that subtle golden glow. Acrylic polymer, on the other hand, doesn't yellow over time. Acrylic paint is made of plastic. Acrylic polymer emulsion is tiny particles of plastic acrylic resin mixed with pigment and water. When you paint with it, the water dries out and the acrylic resin particles fuse together. The reason plastic is so harmful to the environment is that it takes forever to degrade, but that's a good thing for your paintings. We tend to believe this fallacy that reinforces a bias towards oils, that they're the more permanent medium because of all the amazing oil paintings we have from art history. While acrylics are still too new for us to have a long historical record of their staying power like we do with oils, accelerated aging tests in laboratories show that acrylics won't fade in time, and in fact will likely outlast oils in every measurable way. Acrylic colors should look the same as they do now after 200 years. Oil paints dry stiffer and more brittle, while acrylics are flexible. You have to be more careful when preparing your surface when you're working with oils. A rigid support like wood is best, is safest in the long term. And if you're painting on canvas with oils, you have to be extra sure that your canvas is primed well. Because oil paints are more acidic, they can be corrosive to the underlying surface if not primed properly with gesso. Another reason to take extra care with priming your surface with oils is if you have an unprimed surface or a surface without a thick enough coat of primer, your surface might absorb too much of the oil out of your paint, which is one cause of your painting developing cracking later on. With acrylics, because they're more flexible, you can paint on paper, any fabric, any surface really, without worrying as much about your painting cracking or wrinkling or flaking in the future. One thing to note is that acrylics are thermoplastic. They become harder in cold temperatures and softer and stickier in warm temperatures. So they won't ever crack or flake the way that oils will, but the surface can still become damaged by exposure to heat. Okay, let's talk about prestige and cost. There is a prestige associated with oil paintings because of the old masters. Well, there is definitely something very exciting about learning the same techniques that those masters from history used. And I recommend that you do. That doesn't mean that those materials and techniques are automatically better. I think if Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo or Rembrandt or Vermeer had access to acrylics at the time, they would have been so stoked to work with them. This is something that we don't often think about with the old masters, is they used oils primarily because that's what they had available to them. Oil paints and mediums are slightly more expensive than acrylics. Even though there are masterful things you can do with acrylics, there's still a stigma against acrylic painting. This idea persists that acrylics are on par with student work because acrylic paints and mediums are cheaper than oils, and it's also because of this pervasive bias in favor of oils, which gets passed from art professors to art students in schools because of the legacy of those old masters using oils. When acrylics were first invented, not too long ago, they were chalky and matte. The colors weren't very vibrant. But over recent decades, as plastics technology has evolved, acrylic paints have evolved too. We now have vibrant, saturated colors we can work with, as well as all this impressive variety of acrylic mediums to achieve different effects. You shouldn't let the pervasive bias towards oils stop you from playing with acrylics. The prestige associated with oil paintings means that they might sell more easily or for higher prices. This is something to consider if you're looking for commercial success in selling your work, but ultimately it's a much less important factor than your creativity and your skill. In the end, it's what you do with your medium that's always more important than what medium you use. Okay, the last thing that I want to talk about is the toxicity of these various products and the ease of cleanup. With oil paints, you have to use volatile solvents which give off toxic fumes. I use Gamsol and other odorless solvents, which are vastly preferable to mineral spirits, which gives me an instant headache. However, even odorless solvents are not truly 100% odorless. If you're sensitive to environmental toxins, you need to be careful with oil paint solvents in particular. For a while I used water mixable oils, and while I did enjoy not needing the solvents, in the end I decided I didn't like them as much as traditional oils because the texture of traditional oils, in my experience, is softer and creamier and nicer to work with. Acrylic paints are less toxic only because you don't use these solvents with them. Otherwise, the pigments themselves are equally toxic, particularly the cadmiums. The experience of painting with acrylics might feel less toxic because to us it's the fumes that bother us. Ventilation is definitely more important when you're using oils. That said, you should take equal care with both about skin contact with the pigments and obviously avoid getting paint in your mouth, whether oil or acrylic. With oils, because the paint dries so slowly, you don't have to clean your brushes right away. You can even leave them sitting in a little bit of oil until your next painting session. It's nice not to have to deal with the cleanup as frequently, but when you do clean your brushes, it's more of a hassle and you have to use solvents, which are often toxic. I recommend using solvent to get most of the paint out of your brush, and then follow by cleaning it with the Masters brand brush cleaner and preserver. Murphy's oil soap is also a good thing to have on hand for cleaning oil brushes. With acrylics, you have to clean your brushes fastidiously after every painting session, and sometimes in the middle of a painting session, because if you leave paint on them for any amount of time, it dries the bristles of your brush together and your brush is ruined forever. However, cleanup can be done with water alone, and it's a breeze, which is a huge plus. One thing I like about acrylics is how easy and fun it is to peel the residue of dried paint off your palette. It comes off as a sheet of plastic. With oils, you need to scrape the paint off your palette before it dries. If paint does dry on your palette, to get it off, you really have to put some muscle into it and use a sharp scraping tool. So to conclude, both of these mediums are very exciting and fun to play with. If you've only ever done one, I encourage you to try the other one. And if you're about to start learning how to paint for the first time, hopefully this information is helpful to you. You could paint every day for your whole life and still have more to learn.